Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Lily Winters never imagined her day would collapse into such an emotional avalanche, but that was the cruel reality delivered by a single moment in which her world shifted beneath her feet when she opened the hotel room door and discovered Kane Ashby, the man she had defended through reputation attacks, legal troubles and family judgment, wrapped in a heated, breathless, all-too-intimate embrace with Phyllis, whose history in Genoa City was already stained with broken marriages, risky gambles and impulsive choices that never seemed to consider the pain of others, and Lily stood frozen in the doorway, her senses flooding with disbelief before the emotional shock detonated into the kind of heartbreak that made it hard to breathe as Kane scrambled away from Phyllis with obvious guilt etched across his face while Phyllis tried, in typical Phyllis fashion, to speak first and control a narrative that did not belong to her. But Lily couldn't hear her voice over the pounding in her ears because she was reliving every memory she had defended, every promise Kane had whispered, every second she had believed their marriage could survive anything, and now here she was staring at proof that loyalty meant nothing when temptation knocked, and even though Lily wanted to scream, she couldn't form a single word as her hands trembled, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in front of them, while Kane tried to explain something meaningless like, "It isn't what it looks like." The most cliché line a cheating partner could ever recite, and as Lily's heartbreaking silence echoed in the room, she finally managed to whisper, voice cracking like glass to the floor, "How long?" But before Kane could answer, Lily walked away, chin-high, dignity intact even in devastation, leaving Phyllis and Kane scrambling in the aftermath of their moment of weakness, while across town Nick Newman was pacing in front of his fireplace, consumed by his own dark tornado of emotions after learning that Matt Clark, the man who had nearly destroyed his life decades earlier, was not only alive but determined to strike again, and Nick vowed with a chilling steadiness that Matt Clark would never get another chance to hurt his family, because this time Nick wasn't a confused young man caught in circumstances beyond his control. He was a father, a protector, and a Newman, and he whispered under his breath that Matt Clark must die, a vow that shook the very foundation of his moral compass, even as rage convinced him it was justified. And while Nick poured himself a drink with hands that trembled between fury and focus, Victoria stood nearby, trying to talk him off the emotional ledge by reminding him that murder wouldn't heal old wounds or bring peace, but Nick wasn't hearing logic as he replayed every traumatic flashpoint Matt had caused. The threats, the near-death moments, the way Sharon had nearly lost herself, the way Nick had lived with scars nobody could see, and now with Matt back in the shadows, Nick felt the old terror mixing with a new determination, not just to defend his family but to eliminate the threat permanently. Yet even as Nick stared into the firelight, imagining the moment he would confront Matt and put an end to it, his path was about to cross with Lily's emotional devastation because pain has a way of bleeding across lives in Genoa City, and Lily found herself wandering the streets trying to catch her breath as every memory of Kane's betrayal played on an endless loop in her mind, and she wondered how he could fall into the arms of a woman like Phyllis, someone who always seemed to gravitate toward destruction like a moth to a flame, because Lily knew Kane wasn't perfect but she believed that after all they had survived, near breakups, health crises, secrets and second chances, they were unbreakable. Yet now she was walking alone, clutching her chest as if trying to hold her heart together as her phone buzzed with messages from Kane begging her to return and talk, messages she didn't even open because she could barely see through her tears, and as she walked in emotional autopilot, she ended up near Crimson Lights, where her shaking hands tried to hold a cup of coffee steady, but the world looked blurry and distorted, and at that exact moment Nick walked in, still radiating that storm of cold fury that comes from a man pushed to the edge, and when he saw Lily, broken and silent, he sat down without asking, as if two shattered souls recognized each other before a word was spoken. Lily Winters never imagined her day would collapse into such an emotional avalanche, but that was the cruel reality delivered by a single moment in which her world shifted beneath her feet when she opened the hotel room door and discovered Kane Ashby, the man she had defended through reputation attacks, legal troubles and family judgment, wrapped in a heated, breathless, all-too-intimate embrace with Phyllis, whose history in Genoa City was already stained with broken marriages, risky gambles and impulsive choices that never seemed to consider the pain of others, and Lily stood frozen in the doorway, her senses flooding with disbelief before the emotional shock detonated into the kind of heartbreak that made it hard to breathe as Kane scrambled away from Phyllis with obvious guilt etched across his face while Phyllis tried, in typical Phyllis fashion, to speak first and control a narrative that did not belong to her. But Lily couldn't hear her voice over the pounding in her ears because she was reliving every memory she had defended, every promise Kane had whispered, every second she had believed their marriage could survive anything. And now here she was staring at proof that loyalty meant nothing when temptation knocked, and even though Lily wanted to scream, she couldn't form a single word as her hands trembled, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in front of them, while Kane tried to explain something meaningless like, "It isn't what it looks like." The most cliché line a cheating partner could ever recite, and as Lily's heartbreaking silence echoed in the room, she finally managed to whisper, voice cracking like glass to the floor, "How long?" But before Kane could answer, Lily walked away, chin-high, dignity intact even in devastation, leaving Phyllis and Kane scrambling in the aftermath of their moment of weakness, while across town Nick Newman was pacing in front of his fireplace, consumed by his own dark tornado of emotions after learning that Matt Clark, the man who had nearly destroyed his life decades earlier, was not only alive but determined to strike again, and Nick vowed with a chilling steadiness that Matt Clark would never get another chance to hurt his family, because this time Nick wasn't a confused young man caught in circumstances beyond his control. He was a father, a protector, and a Newman, and he whispered under his breath that Matt Clark must die, a vow that shook the very foundation of his moral compass, even as rage convinced him it was justified. And while Nick poured himself a drink with hands that trembled between fury and focus, Victoria stood nearby, trying to talk him off the emotional ledge by reminding him that murder wouldn't heal old wounds or bring peace. But Nick wasn't hearing logic as he replayed every traumatic flashpoint Matt had caused. The threats, the near-death moments, the way Sharon had nearly lost herself, the way Nick had lived with scars nobody could see, and now with Matt back in the shadows, Nick felt. Claire Grace had spent weeks observing every suspicious move Audra Charles made, quietly collecting the kinds of details that didn't just expose wrongdoing but shattered reputations, and in Genoa City reputations were sometimes worth more than fortunes, which made the power of truth a weapon Claire was now fully prepared to use, though she never imagined that her decision to finally move against Audra would place her at the center of a war that pulled in Phyllis Summers, who at that very moment was about to be shocked by the reality of Kane Ashby's true intentions she had misread, misinterpreted, and perhaps even manipulated without realizing that Kane was no longer the man she believed he was, and Claire, moving with the precision of someone who had lived under manipulation and gaslighting for years, was done being silent and done pretending that Audra's polished smile and flawless wardrobe hid anything other than ambition coated in deceit. And every time Claire watched Audra lie her way through boardrooms, flirt her way through negotiations, and maneuver herself into power circles with that quiet serenity that hid her ruthlessness, Claire felt the fire of justice growing stronger inside her, because Claire knew the truth. Audra wasn't just opportunistic, she was dangerous, and the damage she caused wasn't collateral, it was intentional, targeted, and strategic, and while Claire had once tried to survive silently, she now realized survival wasn't enough. Empowerment meant lifting the truth into the light and letting the guilty burn beneath the brilliance of their own lies. And Claire spent late nights scrolling through call logs, recording suspicious conversations, gathering contracts that were doctored, meeting with sources who were terrified to go on record. But Claire had something none of them did, resolve, and she wasn't afraid anymore, not of Audra, not of the Newman name she would be challenging, not even of the fallout that would inevitably come when the truth detonated, because she had already survived the worst the world had tried to turn her into, and now she was determined to use her strength the right way. And while Claire was preparing her evidence and rehearsing the speech she would soon deliver that would pull the silk sheet off Audra's carefully crafted image, Phyllis was on the opposite side of Genoa City confronting a reality she had never anticipated. Kane wasn't the man she thought he was, and not in the way that came with romance, passion, or redemption, but in a way that left Phyllis frozen in disbelief because the more she spoke to Kane, the more she realized that he had never been acting out of desperation or loneliness when he reached toward her, but out of calculation, a chilling purposeful logic that made Phyllis, who had manipulated more than her share of lives, feel suddenly like the one who had been played, and Kane, with his calm demeanor and remorseful eyes, wasn't spiraling under the weight of Lily's heartbreak the way Phyllis assumed he would be. And that stunned her because Kane, who had always worn insecurity like a shadow, now seemed to be moving with a confidence that made Phyllis uncomfortable, because this wasn't a man ashamed of his mistakes. This was a man who had a plan, a man who had chosen his path, and now Phyllis realized she was just a piece on Kane's board, not the queen she had believed herself to be, and that realization rattled her in a way few moments had, and while Claire had no idea the emotional earthquakes happening on Kane's end of Genoa City, she was deeply aware that exposing Audra would put dominoes in motion she couldn't control, because Audra wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat quietly. Audra fought back, sometimes with poise, sometimes with venom, but always with effectiveness, and Claire, knowing this battle could escalate into corporate and personal war, kept her movements quiet and deliberate, choosing allies with surgical precision, and one of those allies, perhaps unexpectedly, was Summer Newman, who also knew firsthand what Audra was capable of, and though Summer and Claire had differences and layers of mistrust between them, they understood one truth: Audra Charles had been allowed to rise unchecked for too long, and if someone didn't stop her soon, she would cement herself at the center of Newman media and crush anyone bold enough to stand in her way. And while Claire and Summer shared whispers in shadowed corners, Audra stood in the glass-walled executive suite, unaware that her empire was already cracking from the inside, reviewing acquisition portfolios and investor connection chains that she had manipulated to force outcomes in her favor, and she smiled, pleased with herself, unaware that Claire was moments away from ripping the floor out from under her. And meanwhile Phyllis poured herself a drink in her apartment, replaying every conversation she'd had with Kane over the past weeks, trying to understand how she had misread him so badly, because she had a history of reading people too well, using that assessment to her benefit or downfall depending on the day. But Kane had slipped beneath her radar, and that scared her because it meant that Kane, who once seemed like a frail man afraid of losing everything, was now someone else entirely, someone who had a quiet agenda that Phyllis didn't yet comprehend, and that realization sent a prickling unease down her spine because Phyllis never liked being the one without the upper hand, especially not emotionally, and as she stared at her reflection in the glass tabletop, she muttered aloud that Kane Ashby had finally evolved, and not into something she knew how to handle. And while Phyllis was unraveling the mystery of Kane's intentions, Lily Winters was at home trying to rebuild herself from the emotional shrapnel he had left behind, determined not to let Kane's betrayal define her future. And it was in that emotional vacuum that Claire, unaware of the ripple effects connecting everyone in Genoa City, printed out the final pieces of evidence, tucked them into a sleek black folder, and prepared to call the meeting that would shatter Audra Charles's image in front of decision-makers who once believed in her. And the weight of that truth pressed against Claire's chest, because she knew that once she spoke, once she exposed everything, there would be no turning back, not just for Audra but for Claire as well, because speaking truth always came with consequences, and Claire was just beginning to understand that exposing a powerful person wasn't a single act. It was a declaration of war. And Genoa City was about to feel the first shockwave. Claire took a slow breath as she rode the elevator upward toward the executive floor at Newman Media, clutching the black folder like a weapon wrapped in manila, and she replayed for the 100th time the moment she decided she was done being silent, done allowing Audra to operate in the shadows without consequences, and she wasn't doing this for applause or revenge, but because a part of her finally understood that speaking up wasn't about destroying someone else. It was about reclaiming the pieces of herself that had been held hostage by years of manipulation. And as the elevator doors opened, Claire stepped onto the polished floor, her heels clicking in rhythm with the racing of her heart. But she didn't falter, because courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was moving anyway. And when she entered the boardroom, she saw faces turn toward her with curiosity, confusion, and the expectation that someone like Claire was there to observe, not disrupt. But today Claire was not the quiet girl simply grateful to be included at the table. Today she was the one who held the truth that could collapse careers, reputations, and possibly corporations. And while Claire placed her folder on the table and waited for Audra to arrive, Phyllis was pacing her penthouse like a caged animal, replaying Kane's cryptic words about needing clarity, about finally being ready to take control. And Phyllis realized that she should have known that Kane, who spent years being pulled and shaped by forces outside his control, would eventually snap into someone who no longer wanted to be the one who was acted upon, but the one who acted, and she wasn't sure if that evolution made him more dangerous or more admirable, and she hated that she didn't know the answer, because uncertainty wasn't a state Phyllis tolerated well, and she poured another drink to calm her nerves, Though she knew the liquid wouldn't bring clarity, only time and strategy would. Two things she had always relied on until suddenly those abilities seemed clouded by Kane's unreadable transformation. And while Phyllis stared into the city skyline, Kane himself was sitting in his own apartment, not pacing or panicking the way Phyllis assumed, but calmly sorting through documents that hinted at his real objective. A plan long in motion, quiet, meticulous, centered not on passion but on reclaiming agency in his personal and professional life. And though it was unclear exactly where his loyalties now stood, Kane was certain of one truth. He was done being controlled by guilt, by emotional debt, or by the expectations of others, and Phyllis happened to be one of the first people to cross his path after that shift, which made her presence in his story accidental rather than meaningful, a realization that left Kane oddly numb. But he knew emotions would only complicate the mission he had begun, and he wasn't going to let them cloud his judgment anymore. Not even love. And while Kane sorted through papers with the calm of someone who had already accepted the destruction he might cause, Claire stood in the boardroom as Audra finally walked in, every eye turning toward the woman whose reputation was built from the perfect fusion of charm, intelligence, and ruthlessness, and Audra smiled at the room, taking her seat with a grace that would intimidate even seasoned executives, unaware that Claire was about to set fire to that polished facade. And Audra flicked her gaze toward Claire with a hint of amusement, as though Claire was nothing more than a minor footnote in the grand narrative of her success. But Claire, with steady breath and level voice, began speaking, calmly explaining that she had gathered information relevant to the company's financial integrity. And at first Audra leaned back with an air of bored superiority, assuming Claire was overreaching out of naivety or ambition. But the moment Claire opened the folder and slid copies of altered contracts, falsified financial movements, and unauthorized corporate leverage maneuvers across the table, the temperature in the room changed instantly, the sound of shifting chairs and withheld gasps creating a charged silence that even the glass walls couldn't contain, and Audra's face, once poised and smug, flickered with something sharp and dangerous, though she masked it quickly beneath a smile that strained at the edges, and she said with a silky tone that Claire misunderstood the documents. But Claire didn't flinch because she had anticipated the denial, and she responded with recorded call transcripts, timestamps, board signatures forged through executive stamp copies, and suddenly every executive in the room was leaning forward, reading, absorbing, and realizing they had been played. And Audra, who had always been remarkably composed, showed the first crack in her mask as she narrowed her eyes and asked Claire who put her up to this, and Claire met her gaze with calm strength and said that nobody put her up to this. She chose it, because she would rather be someone who exposed a lie than someone who lived under one. And as the board members looked between the two women, the room felt like a throne room witnessing the dethroning of a monarch. And while Audra prepared to defend herself, perhaps even counterattack, Claire stood straighter, not with arrogance but with a newfound inner strength born from reclaiming her voice. And while that corporate duel unfolded, Phyllis grabbed her keys and headed out the door, needing answers from Kane directly because she refused to exist in emotional suspense when she could demand clarity from the source, and she drove through the streets with the precision of a woman who had saved herself too many times to wait around hoping others would rescue her. And when she reached Kane's door, she didn't knock gently. She pounded, the sharp sound echoing down the hallway, Kane opening the door moments later with an unreadable expression, and Phyllis walked past him into the living room because politeness was for calmer relationships than theirs. And she turned to face him, demanding to know what game he was really playing. And Kane, instead of stammering apologies or emotional pleas, simply sat down, folded his hands, and told her the truth as he saw it, that he was tired of being a supporting character in his own life, tired of apologizing for mistakes he spent years paying for, tired of being predictable, controllable, and constantly punished even when he tried to be the man everyone expected. And Phyllis was stunned because she wasn't prepared for a version of Kane who had emotionally detached from the approval of others, a man who wasn't angry or bitter but focused and determined. And she realized that she had underestimated him, believing he was seeking comfort when in reality he was repositioning himself in a much larger way. And Phyllis, who more than most admired self-reinvention, felt something unexpected, not attraction, not sympathy but respect. The rare respect that comes when someone breaks their own chains without asking permission. And she sank slowly into a chair, finally understanding that Kane was no longer acting reactively. He was making deliberate moves. And she asked the obvious question. What was he planning? But Kane didn't answer directly because some truths, especially in Genoa City, unfold with time rather than explanation, and as Phyllis studied him, realizing the man she once believed she could predict was now a wild card with the potential to become a major player in the shifting power board of the city, Claire faced the full force of Audra's fury, because Audra had no intention of going down quietly, and she rose from her chair with the grace of a queen resisting execution, ready to argue, manipulate, and emotionally dissect the board the way she always had, and the executives, caught between two forces of certainty and charisma, watched as the power dynamic in the room shifted with every breath, and Claire, though trembling on the inside, never let her expression falter because she understood that battles aren't won by the loudest voice, they are won by the one who refuses to look away. And as the corporate war raged in that polished room, Kane and Phyllis sat quietly together, the silence between them no longer strained or explosive, but contemplative, two people realizing that nothing in Genoa City would look the same after this night. And somewhere in the unpredictable future, their stories, like Claire's, like Audra's, like Lily's, were about to collide in ways none of them saw coming.